Hello everybody, thank you very much for joining me for my review of the 1984 horror film A Nightmare on Elm Street, directed by Wes Craven and starring John Saxon, Heather Langenkamp, Johnny Depp, and Robert Englund as Freddy Krueger. And I would call A Nightmare on Elm Street a horror classic, and I think there's two major reasons for that. Number one, this film did a lot of different things with slasher films. In 1984, slasher films were a very popular type of horror film. They were very common, and they were somewhat popular as well. And most of these films were just straight up, revenge films where some kind of killer would just go after people. But A Nightmare on Elm Street kind of helped change some of that. It added a creativity and even kind of a psychological horror aspect by having the killer be someone who could get to people through their dreams. This may not seem like much now, but this was considered a pretty interesting idea at the time, and I think it's one of the reasons that the film made the impact that it did. This also led to being able to come up with some very inventive kill sequences that were different from your standard fare, and I think those are handled well in the film as well. But the other big reason, and maybe even the more major reason that Nightmare on Elm Street is remembered as a classic, is the character of Freddy Krueger. He was kind of a slasher type killer character that nobody had really seen before. He actually had a personality. He talked more than most of these other type characters. He wasn't just a guy that ran around with a mask. And there's nothing wrong with those types of characters. Some of those are great, but Freddy Krueger definitely stands out as something different. And this mostly works because of the great performance by Robert Englund, who's still remembered as Freddy Krueger to this day, which is pretty much the biggest compliment I can ever give an actor, that after all these years, Robert Englund is still remembered for this role. And if he wouldn't have been good in this role, the film would not have worked. Another good thing about A Nightmare on Elm Street is that it takes itself very seriously. There's obviously a lot of sequels to this film, and they kind of handled the whole dream concept a little differently in their own ways, tried some different tones. But the original film, I think it was very important to take itself seriously because the audience really had to believe in this concept. If the concept of this film would have failed and people wouldn't have believed in it, the whole film would have fallen apart. I also think that Heather Langenkamp is very good in this film and maybe a little bit underrated. Her character could have easily become a horror cliche and just become uninteresting, but I was actually rooting for her by the end of the film, and I thought she gave a very realistic and very good performance in this film. As far as special effects and makeup go, another very important element of this film, I think they hold up relatively well. There's a few elements that are slightly dated, but to me that adds to part of the charm. Maybe I'm a little biased, I don't know, but I kind of have a soft spot for effects from this time period in the 80s, as they were really trying some new and innovative things at the time. If there's any negatives at all to this film, I would say one big one is that the film could have used actually a little bit more of Freddy Krueger. It's actually amazing going back and rewatching this film how few scenes Robert Englund is really in. Another tribute to how great his performance was, how memorable he was with just a few scenes. I'm not saying to overuse the character, but I thought he could have been in the film just a little bit more. Also, the parents in this movie come across as kind of a plot device. One in particular seems just in the film to give off exposition. It's no big deal, but it's kind of typical of this kind of film, unfortunately. And also, I'm not saying this is a positive or a negative necessarily. Opinions may vary. But although the ending fits in very well with the tone of the film and is somewhat clever, it could feel a little bit gimmicky to some people, and I wouldn't really argue with that point of view. But overall, A Nightmare on Elm Street, despite a few small issues, is really a great horror film that pretty much succeeds in everything it sets out to accomplish. So overall, I'm going to give A Nightmare on Elm Street a 4.5 out of 5. This is definitely a horror film that I recommend to fans of influential horror films, slashers, and psychological horror films, which Nightmare on Elm Street is an excellent blend of all of those things. So 4.5 out of 5 for A Nightmare on Elm Street. And as always, thank you very much for watching.